Hi, folks. I am so glad that you could be here to watch this session. This is our 8th ever conference with the Rehumanize team, or formerly known as Life Matters Journal. And I'm just really grateful and excited for this opportunity to talk with you guys. I haven't given this talk, I think, in like 5 years maybe, and kind of revamp some of the material to add more statistics and fun stuff like that. So hopefully you'll like what you hear today, or at least learn something. So at Rehumanize International, we welcome people from both a just war theory background and a strict pacifist background to come together and oppose all forms of violence. Both positions have something profoundly valuable to add to the conversation on violence, peacemaking, and building a way forward where every human is respected, valued, and protected. In turn, we must be brave enough to examine our own positions on defense, both personal and national, and see the deeper implications of this philosophy on our action and policy. Often in our world today, when we are faced with questions of gun control, terrorism, aggression, and war abroad, politicians and everyday citizens look to justify our nation's military decisions in defense of nation and the rights of the individual in personal defense. So today I'm putting forth the query, what constitutes a just personal defense? And following from that answer, what might we deduce constitutes a just national defense? Following personalist ethics, the question becomes much less of a, how can I use violent force against another human being? And instead, the question becomes more oriented towards, when a human or a group of humans is under violent attack, what is the most just response in a way that respects the dignity of all involved? Since we believe that all human beings have intrinsic, immutable worth based in their human nature, we know that aggressive violence is inherently contrary to this dignity. To act in aggressive violence treats other humans as mere means to an end, or treats them as if their worth were derived from some extrinsic or outside force. However, defensive action falls into a different category, morally speaking. Any harm committed during a defensive action that is rightly intended and rightly executed could be considered a double effect. Now, what is double effect? For example, in the case illustrated in the diagram here, the attacker jumping Lydia is the impetus event. Lydia's intention of the response is to stop the attack, and her response itself is to use her martial arts skills to stop the attack, and her, including maybe a limited chokehold to cause the attacker to pass out, or maybe, like his arm gets hurt while she is, trying to get more distance from him so she can get away. The response action is not itself intended to harm the attacker, but only to stop the attack. The intention was good, the action was morally neutral, and the end result is that the attack was stopped. The side or double effect of that intended response action might be that the attacker has some bruises and a concussion or slight hypoxia from Lydia's martial arts response action. Though these actions in the double effect box are foreseeable, they are not intended harm. The central point of double effect is that action to save a life, even that which may cause foreseeable but unintended harm, may be permissible under a personalist philosophy. The reason that this is so is because each and every human being's life is worth the same. As such, we may never take action to intentionally harm another, but we may take action to protect our own if it is imperiled. Balancing these two truths is the crux of the philosophy of just defense. In declaring that all human life is worthy of respect, we do not prohibit all defensive action, but we do require that any action taken be for the primary purpose of defense, or stopping an attack, or warding off an aggressor. We may not act with the intention of ending the life of any such attacker, but only with the intent to stop an ensuing attack. According to personalist ethics, we must respect every human being's life, including even those who may be committing or who have already committed violence. The actions of a human being do not impact their inherent and immutable moral value. I posit that in this respect, we bear the responsibility to first attempt to prevent, ward off, or defend from violent attack in the least violent means probable to affect a peaceful outcome in any given situation. Because our inherent dignity is not forfeited by any action nor inaction. However, in some rare situations of personal defense, the least violent means probable may involve using violent defensive action, such as the use of a gun. But the principle of double effect could apply in the situation such that any harm caused by such moral defensive action then would be a side effect, even if foreseen. However, once any such attacker has ceased aggressive action, the victim cannot, in good morality, exchange roles and begin acting out of violent aggression, even if that aggression was geared towards preventing the original aggressor from ever attacking them again. In this case, I often think of Ender Wiggin in Ender's Game, if any of y'all have read that, who several times in the course of the story attacks another child so as to prevent any future attacks. That sort of reasoning doesn't work here. It's not personalist. In addition, the intentions and will of the victim carry much gravity in weighing the morality of such defensive action. So if the direct will and intention is to kill, perhaps out of vengeance or zeal, then the action would not respect human dignity in all instances. In fact, it would be a selective preference for which human lives to respect and which to destroy. In this case, destroying the lives of those who have done bad things, which is contrary to true respect for intrinsic human dignity. Within pacifist thought, there's a range of what people believe to be pacifism. Ultimately, they all believe that responding to violence with violence is not the answer. Many also have perhaps loose interpretations of what constitutes violence. They may say that all guns are always violent, but that learning a martial art like judo to use an attacker's aggression against them in a form of like motion or how would you say momentum transfer, and to use that against them to stop the attack is not violent. But nearly all of the pacifists that we've encountered consistently come back to the idea that nearly no uses of guns and more lethal weapons satisfy the principle of last resort. They would say that even in interpersonal conflict, there are a near endless range of nonviolent responses to harm or threatened violence that are very rarely explored through wide trainings and educational opportunities, except in pacifist spaces. Many who adhere to just war or just defense theory have a profound respect for those who would not defend themselves or who believe in literally turning the other cheek. The argument could be made, though, that part of respecting every human being's life is acknowledging a moral right to defend oneself and others from an ensuing attack. I doubt there is anyone who would say that instead of fighting off an attacker, we should just let him rape a 2-year-old child. There is indeed a way to practice just defense even within a peaceful paradigm. However, acknowledging that there is a moral right to just defense does not mean that anything and everything done in the name of defense is morally permissible. In fact, the amount of times I've heard people declare that our current wars are just wars speaks to, oop, did I skip a slide? Whoa. What? Oh no. Doop, 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 boop, boop. Okay. I guess I accidentally put that I had a slide here where I do not. Oh well. Sorry about that. So, however, acknowledging that there is a moral right to defense does not mean that anything and everything done in the name of defense is morally permissible. In fact, the amount of times I've heard people declare that our current wars are just wars speaks to the fact that our culture has practically zero understanding of what just war constitutes. Here, I think it would be appropriate to look into what has historically made up a theory of just war. How does our personalism affect how we implement structures of just defense on a macro scale? And what can we glean from this philosophy that transfers from the macro to the micro? In the case of self-defense, people often imagine some sort of altercation as the first thing. However, that's not really where defense begins. Self-defense begins before a physical attack even happens. It starts with awareness. It starts with thinking creatively about nonviolent solutions. It starts with building cultures of peace in society. It starts with seeking to build community with others. It starts with a commitment to the dignity of others. It also starts with being prepared, in as much as is possible, with least force techniques of self-defense. So you may desire to take a self-defense course. I've taken 2. Or maybe something like a grappling type martial arts course like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that often teaches principles of peace and least force in their use of self-defense. Ultimately, a truly just defense of self begins by evaluating all of the requirements of just defense and developing plans for peaceful resolution before you even get into such difficult situations. We believe that if human beings' life is truly to be respected across all time and space, then our nations, militaries, and international powers bear the same responsibility to respect and defend them in all cases. This is especially difficult to stand for in our day and age of militarism and far-reaching imperial violence in the name of liberty. But we firmly uphold that we can look to the theory of just defense to outline an adequately good moral theory for national defense and military action. Firstly, we would claim that according to a theory of just defense, all violent action must follow a just cause, and therefore only be defensive in nature, whether that is defending our own lives, our fellow citizens, or potentially the lives of another nation or people. As an individual, you can't start a fight because someone said something rude about your mom or stole something of yours. You can't threaten someone who offends you. That's escalation. Initiating a fight does not qualify as self-defense. However, let's say someone near you is being attacked, or you are being attacked. This is where your planned defensive response ideally kicks in. And it must be mentioned that to act in the name of preemptive defense is a farce and cannot be done. A person could not morally break and enter and maim or kill his neighbor on suspicion of an attack that might occur someday. Rather, there is a burden of proof of an ensuing or absolutely certain attack on the part of the defender in order that they might best respect the lives and dignity of the so-called aggressor. And because there is no absolute certainty until an action is ensuing, it would be quite impossible for any defending nation to launch a preemptive strike. Next, it would follow that in order to best respect the lives of all humans, including individual attackers, the militants, and the civilians in an aggressing nation, violence and war must be used as a last resort. This aspect is key, possibly most important in the entire framework of just defense. Physical defense should be your last option. De-escalation is the goal in situations of high conflict. In these circumstances, both individuals and nations can benefit from apology, diplomatic conversation, and a non-threatening posture. It is far better to apologize even when you're not in the wrong than to get into an altercation and risk harm and violence and lives lost. If their anger cannot be dissuaded, then evading, leaving, or running is better than being put in a situation where you have to defend yourself physically. If all these things are exhausted, that is the only point where defense is justified. All diplomatic efforts before war, during an attack, and afterwards must be pursued so as to offer peace and the utmost respect for life. As a last resort also means that preemptive defense is immoral, because in doing so, the defending nation has not sought all other means and options of peace. However, at times, under a current attack, the proper response would indeed be to neutralize weapons to protect the peoples of the defending nation, though this may be done by non-violent means with the current technology of our military. Two other aspects to be considered in the justness of a nation's defense are proportionality of action and the probability of success. It's true that it's hard to gauge personal self-defense for efficacy, and though some defensive action might have no guarantee of success, e.g., if you're a small person being attacked and kidnapped by a larger person, that isn't so much a reason to not defend yourself. If you want to remain alive and unkidnapped, then giving everything you've got to fight back against a much more physically overpowering attacker is vital. The standard of probability of success is a little harder to translate from the micro, but it is one that is vital in community and national defense. Probability of success may seem arbitrary and unfounded, but in order to best respect life, especially those of civilians, we must consider whether our actions in defending a nation would not bring more loss of life only to result in a certain loss. Proportionality is crucial because it is that distinction that would prevent us from switching roles and becoming the attacker, or attacking an innocent in order to stop an attack. If someone punches you in the face because of something you said about their favorite team, it would be disproportionate to shoot them with a gun. The goal should always be to end the attack, not to intend to kill the attacker. Proportionality on a national scale is closely linked herein. If any nation is to wage war against an aggressor, then all action must be taken to avoid civilian casualties and collateral damage as much as possible. And any war's benefit must outweigh any negative effects of such action. This requirement is to prevent unjust killing and a loss of life, and to ensure that the motives of the defender remain purely rooted in defense of nation and defense of individuals, and not in vengeful action. This, of course, leads us to motive. In order for a defensive nation to be just, like a just defense of self, any violent action must be taken out of the cause of defense. This means that we cannot seek out past aggressors due to vengeance or zeal for one's own homeland, but only use any violence as a proportional last resort for the purpose of current defense and protection. This ensures that the defensive action is moral inasmuch as any death that results follows the principle of double effect, and not out of an immoral desire to destroy a human being's life. The last but not least of the requirements for just national defense is the proper consent and authority of the defending nation, aka the competent authority requirement. Think about it this way. Everyone has authority over their own person. Everyone has a right to defend themselves. This question becomes tricky when someone is being beaten or attacked in front of you, and the application of this rule can be very situational. If the victim in question, e.g. an abuse victim, doesn't want you to use violence to stop the attack, then that individual's opinion should absolutely be respected, and other means of intervention should be considered and used. This is often hard because abuse victims often love the people who are abusing them, because the people who are abusing them are those who are closest to them. And so respecting that you don't want, like that an abuse victim doesn't want severe violent means used in their defense is something that should be considered. In the case of national defense in the United States, our Constitution requires that the president get consent from Congress to engage in war, and the Congress shall declare wars. This is to ensure that the people of the nation who comprise the military support the decision to engage in a war. This follows Griset's rule of ethics because the military is composed of national citizens who should consent to the use of force either in defending themselves or in defending others. The executive branch of government does not represent the whole of the nation, and at this point does not even represent those everyday individuals in the military who would lay their lives on the line. To respect their lives, we must have the proper consent and authority to give them agency in such a decision. This is much less a question in personal defense because we act as agents for ourselves and make choices to defend our own persons and others. But in the case of national conflict, this question is of the utmost importance so as to properly respect the lives of combatants who work to defend our nation. This presents a case of what constitutes a just defense of individual, community, and nation. Proper consent and authority of the defending nation, proportionality and probability of success, motive and defensive nature of the action, and use of violence and war as a last resort. All of these aspects are present in personal defense, but are presented in different ways. Each is required in order for a national defense to be moral and just. This theory cannot be used to justify war ex post facto, but it is meant to guide and prevent unjust action at all. However, a lot of national leaders like to call the wars that they're waging just, without really adhering to the actual just war theory. In truth, if all nations followed such a policy of ethics and just national defense, there wouldn't be war at all. So all these principles that I've just mentioned are actually principles of just defense found in just war theory. Though just war theory is often associated with Catholic thought and St. Augustine in particular, it is a relic of the pre-Christian era. I will just go over those tenets again so you can remember them. So war, or defense of self, when necessary, must be conducted according to these moral guidelines: just cause, competent authority, proportionality, including avoiding civilian casualties, probability of success, and last resort or least force. Especially in the United States, but all over the world, honestly, citizens and peoples everywhere have the responsibility to hold accountable those nations who engage in military conflict, to demand that they only act according to just defense. In the US, there is a startling history of flouting such demands of just moral action and national defense in practically every war in recent memory. Even World War II, which is widely considered to have just cause by most ethicists, wasn't a justly waged war by the Allied powers. Not only did we not accept refugees from many nations in Europe who were being overtaken by Germany, but when we dropped the nuclear bombs, little boy and fat man, on Japan, we instantaneously killed over 120,000 people, most of whom were civilians. The firebombing of Tokyo killed around 100,000 people, again, mostly civilians. And the firebombing of Dresden, experienced by author Kurt Vonnegut and profiled in many of his writings, killed 25,000 people. Vonnegut wrote of the war, "There can be no doubt that the Allies fought on the side of right and the Germans and Japanese on the side of wrong. World War II was fought for near holy motives. But I stand convinced that the brand of justice in which we dealt, wholesale bombings of civilian populations, was blasphemous. That the enemy did it first has nothing to do with the moral problem. What I saw of our air war as the European conflict neared an end had the earmarks of being an irrational war for war's sake. Soft citizens of the American democracy learned to kick a man below the belt and make the bastard scream." We can honestly think of no example where the principles of just defense were followed for the defending nation and their military force for the duration of the war in any modern case. Today, the US military forces are engaged in approximately 10 military conflicts, of which none have been declared as war by Congress. That alone is a direct defiance of proper authority and consent of the defending nation. On top of that, the Army took great steps to condition soldiers to be comfortable with killing. World War II infantry training had involved shooting practice on the standard round bullseye targets. But in the years that followed World War II, the Army replaced the bullseye circles with human-shaped targets. This would teach them a reflexive fire training, which conditioned these soldiers to bypass their human moral reasoning by firing quickly, on sight, before a thought about the humanity of the other man could ever enter their mind. As cited in Rob Arner's Consistently Pro-Life, sorry, I have the wrong citation on this slide. It's from Rob Arner's Consistently Pro-Life, The Ethics of Bloodshed in Ancient Christianity. Quote, the army gradually increased the fire rates in the following wars so that it grew from World War II's 25% to 55% in the Korean conflict, to upwards of 80% in Vietnam. In modern conflicts, such as in Iraq, the fire rate is well over 90%, as the training soldiers receive works hard to condition the suppression of the innate instinct against killing. Yet, our governments and politicians do their best to justify such actions in the name of liberty and peace. It makes one wonder whether it's even possible today to justly serve in the US military, considering that the history of military action by our nation has been steeped in unjust, often cruel, and systematically dehumanizing violence. In addition, nuclear arms can never be weapons of a just war. The only thing that makes nuclear weapons deterrents from war is the ever-present possibility of mutually assured destruction. They only function as deterrents if we're willing to use them against civilian city centers. Because intentionally killing upwards of hundreds of thousands of human beings is inherently unjust, retaining nuclear weapons in any form, whether deployed or non-deployed, is contrary to human dignity and a culture of peace. We may not do evil, that good may come of it. We reject the use or storage of nuclear weapons merely because another nation has them. We should not allow the injustice of other nations to dislodge our moral compass and provoke us to evil. Believing in a human-centered ethics and praxis, we demand an end to all nuclear arms and a ban on the development of weapons of mass destruction. And instead, our vast military technology should be ordered towards defense systems that could prevent a nuclear weapon from ever touching down on US soil. As long as the United States and other nations maintain their current nuclear weapons arsenals, they are guilty of planning and preparing for indiscriminate and disproportionate uses of force, in effect, for committing war crimes. We must consider the technology that we have today put in the hands of our soldiers and these weapons' relation to the nature of war. How can we instill in our soldiers the defensive and personalist nature of justice that must be upheld in any war, instead of the patriotic priorities like zealous love of country or the vengeful aims rooted at the vague concept of terror? And how can we possibly engage in wars not seeking to kill, but only to defend ourselves? So many of the weapons we have today are created with the purpose of killing in the most effective manner possible, from machine guns to grenades, bombs to chemical warfare. If our soldiers are trained with these weapons, trained to kill most effectively, instead of learning best practices of defense, we train killers, not defenders. And in training how to kill, we teach killing as a means of defense, instead of defense first, with the possibility of death as a side effect. With the weapons that we have today, it becomes actually rather doubtful whether a truly just war is even possible in this day and age. Holding our militaries and our governments accountable is of the utmost importance if we wish to see peace and true proper respect for human life and dignity. As neighbors to our fellow man, we have a responsibility to hold others accountable for their actions and to stop abuses of this reasoning and abuses of human dignity. We would not tolerate for one instant a neighbor coming into our home in the name of defense and hurting us because he thinks we might someday be planning to attack him. Likewise, police action like firing bullets at, kicking and abusing nonviolent actors, especially protesters just using their First Amendment free speech and assembly rights, should not be tolerated. And finally, actions like capital punishment are indubitably unnecessary in the developed world for the safety and defense of the public, and as such can only be seen as used for vengeance or zeal. The death penalty in the United States is used in a manner that is decidedly not defensive in nature, because we have the capability to contain any violent offenders and keep society safe. We should hold both our neighbors and our local authorities accountable for unjust action in the name of defense. We hope that this analysis of defense through the personalist framework, that we've helped to illuminate the issues of personal and national defense in light of the dignity of the human person. To help us attain the end of human fulfillment, we must uphold every human being's life. And we must not seek to justify our actions, but to act justly first and foremost. In evaluating these problems from a perspective of respect for all instances of life, we hope to both hold neighbor and nation accountable for their actions that are contrary to life, and engender such an attitude in our culture so that we may together work to seek peace. I wanted to share just some questions to ask yourself and think on moving forward. I think it's important to evaluate our own internal compasses and where we're coming from. So just things to think on. You can feel free to take a picture of this slide and come back to it later. But were you aware of all the different requirements of just defense? Which ones stand out to you and why? And what sorts of news stories had you seen in the past that included language implying that the current or recent historical military conflicts were just? How did that framing in the media impact your perspective of just war theory as a whole? And are there any practical actions that you hope or plan to take to develop nonviolent conflict resolution skills? How will you endeavor to live by these principles and work to make defensive violence a last resort in your life? Lastly, I just wanted to put up some further reading suggestions. I just realized I forgot to include Rob Arner's Consistently Pro-Life on this list, but I'm just going to leave up this slide while we get to some Q&A. So I'm going to go to the Q&A tab now. Okay, go back to the first questions. So from Julia, how is it logically possible to talk about opposing all forms of violence and justifying some forms of violence at the same time? Julia, that's a great question. So at Rehumanize International, our mission statement is specifically that we seek to end all forms of aggressive violence because we do think that there is a human right to defend oneself from violent action that is happening to you. So that being said, I actually think I personally tend to fall more like myself, more under like a Christian pacifist sort of perspective. But I think it's still valuable to the larger conversation to be talking about like what constitutes just defense of self or of your family or of neighbor or community or nation. Because I do think that it's a natural right to be able to defend oneself. That being said, as you just heard during the whole talk, there's a lot of things that we need to be doing to make sure that our defense of self and community and whatnot is actually a last resort, and that we're prepared with strategies to be able to get away from, like violent situations as much as possible. Okay. Anonymous question, is revolutionary violence ever justified to bring down a violent system, e.g. fascism? So I definitely think that it's hypothetically possible for, like people of the, I guess, a proletarian variety to band together against a oppressive system like fascism. I think that action against the Nazi German state, by people was technically like a just cause. Really, the question is like, are we carrying out that defense in a way that is actually respectful, like even of the lives of people who were Nazis, because they still have inherent human dignity. And that's like, maybe that's controversial to say, but, like everyone can change, like we have seen, hundreds of stories of, people who have gone from, abortion clinic workers to now pro-life advocates, and, people who were neo-Nazis who are now racial justice advocates. So we still need to respect their lives. That being said, I'm a huge advocate of nonviolent resistance. And so I definitely think that that's, the first avenue that should be taken. And groups like the White Rose in the era of Nazi Germany, I think were in large part responsible for the Nazi Party falling. So, I think that as much as possible, we should seek nonviolent resolution. Okay, next question here. I'm having a hard time interpreting Dane's question, so I'll come back to it. Mary, thoughts on citizens being able to protect themselves against their government? Super good question, Mary. I absolutely think that is something that is important. I think also at the same time that with the weapons that exist today, it's going to be pretty hard, if not impossible, to defend ourselves as little guys from the weaponry that the United States military has within its power. So going back to it, like probably your best recourse in terms of fighting back against the state is honestly using nonviolent direct action. And this is something that Gandhi was a huge advocate of. The word that he used for it was satyagraha, which was a form of like peaceful, nonviolent direct action. So definitely like look up what he was up to, because his example, like Gandhi's example, was influenced by Tolstoy. And Gandhi influenced Martin Luther King Jr., who, has been a massive influence for nonviolent resistance movements since then. Because I think a lot of them understand that it's really hard to fight militaries that are that large, as little guys who don't have a military. Okay. Do you think there is any intrinsic difference between war and terrorism? Ooh, super spicy question. So I think the way that war is waged in this day and age, and like because it doesn't fall under just war theory in any way, shape, or form, often looks, feels, acts like terrorism on the whole. And it's really hard, honestly, for me to like morally differentiate between the two. Like we might say that we have just reason to be over in the Middle East, and yet, like we're not out there acting with what would it be called? Like jus in bello, like justice in the war. Like we're not waging the war justly in any way. And, often targeting civilians. And in that case, to me, like it's just like so morally similar that it's really hard to differentiate the two. Okay. Miles, yes, we'll be sharing like slides and documents from all of the speakers in a big email to everyone after the conference. So definitely like keep an eye out for that. There are so many questions here. Is killing wounded soldiers or killing soldiers who have surrendered revenge? I'd say so. Yeah, definitely. I don't know if that was a long enough answer for you, but yeah. Let me see. We have some more. There was a question about. So I'm going to try to read Dane's question again and try to understand it. Regarding deliberately or likely lethal self-defense, isn't the mechanism used for it is one of killing without trial and thus intrinsic dehumanizing evil that kills as a means to an end, ergo not pro-life. So I always am recommending like least force as a part of like last resort. So I don't see like lethal weapons as something that is necessary unless you're disabled and otherwise incapable of defending yourself. Maybe that's a spicy take, but I think in general, we should always appeal to the conscience of the person if we have that opportunity, that we should, like use, like I took self-defense classes. So I learned, like ways to like get out of holds, like a chokehold or like a wrist hold or, like arm holds, etc. that would allow me to like get away from a situation. And in general, I think that this is going to be maybe super spicy too. I was taking an ethics class. Oh no, I'm out of time. I think I'm out of time. I'm pretty sure I'm out of time. Am I out of time? Yeah, I started at 4. This is 4:45. Okay, I have to be done. I'm sorry. If you want to come chat with me, I'll be around the expo booth later, or you could send me an email. I'm sorry. I try to get as many questions as possible. Thank you all so much, and I hope you learned a lot, and definitely check out those further reading suggestions to learn more.